Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Murnau. Today on the program, we talk about wildlife issues in our region. Joining us is Chris Smith, Southwest Wildlife Advocate for WildEarth Guardians. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks a ton for the opportunity. I'm excited to be here.
Well, there's a lot of issues regarding wildlife in our region and here in New Mexico, of course. I want to start off talking about the Mexican gray wolf. There's been a lot of concern about this issues from many different perspectives, but I'd like to get yours on this perspective. We heard recently that U.S. Fish and Wildlife announced an increase in the number of Mexican gray wolves, around 196. That was reported this year. So I'd like to hear from you, when you hear the growth in the population, what are some of your thoughts with that?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, this is a population that is being totally rebuilt from scratch. So any growth is a positive sign. That said, this most recent count of 196 is one of the smallest growths in terms of percentage that we've seen over the last, decade. And so the slowing of that growth is problematic. We want to see these wolves expand throughout their historical range, and that's going to require a large number of wolves. But perhaps more important than that is, the growth of the population is good, but that may not be the best indication of how the population is faring in terms of recovery and restoration. These wolves are descended from 7 total founding wolves, so they have a very limited gene pool. And that gene pool in the wild population is growing smaller and smaller. There's less genetic diversity in the wild population than there has been historically. And that leaves this population susceptible to disease, to other impacts, and it leaves them vulnerable to, decreasing or even being wiped out. So again, that number is good. I want to see growth every year, but again, it may not be the most telling number when we're talking about actually recovering these wolves in a scientific sense.
Okay, just to give our audience a perspective, how bad was it with this wolf population? How low was it when they decided to make sure that protections happened for this wolf population?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there were actually 0 known Mexican wolves in the wilds of the United States when this recovery effort began. So all of the wolves that are in the wild right now stem from wolves that were taken into captivity from Mexico or were already in captivity when the recovery efforts began. So we're going from 0, if that answers your question. And the first wolves were re-released into the wild in 1998.
Okay, so federal wildlife officials did say when they made the announcement of the slight growth in the population that they were very concerned about the high mortality rate with the wolf population. What are your concerns with that high mortality rate, and what do you think can help address this issue?
Yeah, there's a couple things, and one of them is really timely. So first and foremost, perhaps the greatest threat to Mexican wolf recovery is humans, and specifically human-caused mortality. So that includes illegal killing of wolves, it includes vehicular collisions, and also, quote-unquote sanctioned killing of wolves by the federal government. And so that's a really big threat. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is right now, as we speak, in the middle of a 30-day public comment period, taking public input on revisions to their recovery plan that seek to address that specific threat of human-caused mortalities. The other problem involving mortalities within the wild population, as I understand it, and not a ton of data has come out yet publicly, but it seems that there's some disease within the population. I've heard of canine distemper being found in some of these wolves. That can be problematic, of course. And again, we harken back to this genetic crisis that these wolves are in and the need for more genetic material to be injected into that wild population to prevent things like susceptibility to canine distemper.
Okay, now you mentioned some data. There is a little bit of data out on this. U.S. Fish and Wildlife released some data in 2019, from 1998 to 2019, the causes of documented Mexican wolf mortalities, illegal mortalities at 57%, natural causes 17%, vehicle collisions 11%, unknown at 10%, and others at 5%. Just to give our audience some background and data on this issue. Now, you bring up the need for the population's genetic diversity. To address that, what are some ways that scientists, researchers have suggested to address the issues with the genetic diversity within the population?
Yeah, well, first, it's important to note that while the wild population of Mexican wolves has this very limited gene pool, there is a captive population of Mexican wolves across the country in breeding facilities, and they have a lot more genetic diversity in those facilities in wolves that have been born or taken into captivity. So it's not as though the world is devoid of these genetics, it's just the wild population in the US. So if we can get some of those genes that are currently in captivity into the wild, we're taking really important steps to addressing that issue. Right now, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service carries out what they call cross-fostering, which is releasing captive-born pups with some of that diverse genetic material into dens and hoping that wild wolves will raise them as if they're their own. And that is, an effective way to get some of that genetic material into the population in the short term. But the combination of pup survival rates and then not knowing if those released pups are actually going to go and breed makes that tactic not entirely dependable. The best way to get the genetic information, the genetic material into the wild population would be to actually release adult wolves, preferably already in bonded pairs, and even more preferably with pups already. You put those wolves out on the landscape, they're already kind of a pack unit. They're much less susceptible to disease and other conflicts, other impacts. And that would be the expedited way to get these genetics into the wild population. Unfortunately, political pressure on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has kind of rendered that tactic unusable right now. We think legally they can do that, but they have shown no desire to do that.
I mean, has there been any research done on this issue that that's the successful way to do that, to address declining populations in wolves? I mean, it doesn't have to be just here in the United States, but anywhere around the world.
I can't speak to specific studies, but I do know of scientists who have pointed at that tactic as the most efficient, expedited way to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Now
and that's how. Sorry to interrupt. That's how this recovery effort began, was the release of adult wolves. That's how the recovery effort in the Yellowstone ecoregion began as well. So it's not as though this is unprecedented, and it has happened over the years here in New Mexico and Arizona. It's just really been minimized again by political pressure.
Okay, so yeah, political pressure. There's obviously some concern from people living in the areas where the wolves are roaming or have been released. They're in our region, in our area, the climate potentially could play a role in the development of this species as well. Can you kind of share with us about how the elements in nature are really contributing to possibly the slow increase in this population? How does drought play a role or anything like that?
Yeah, so a couple things. First and foremost is that wolves and Mexican wolves are included in there. They're habitat generalists. So while they do need certain parameters to thrive and survive, they are not like other imperiled species that need very specific habitat types. Wolves, as long as there's a prey base there and as long as they're by and large protected from human interference, they will do okay. That said, climate change is happening. It is a major factor, especially here in the Southwest, as we're seeing. And so the science indicates that Mexican wolves will move further northward as these climate impacts persist, because that's, there's going to be a drying and warming phenomenon, and these wolves are going to seek refuge further north into the Grand Canyon region, into the Southern Rockies where I live, to find expanded habitat to recover in.
Okay, you wrote an op-ed about this issue at the end of last year, citing studies that researchers have said that the Grand Canyon region and Southern Rockies are wonderful areas for this population to potentially thrive. Can you kind of give us some insight on that?
Yeah, so the best available science indicates that real science-driven recovery for the Mexican wolf would entail between 750 and 1,000 wolves in the wilds dispersed into three subpopulations, one in the Gila bioregion where they are right now, one in the Grand Canyon region, and one in the Southern Rockies, again, kind of northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. And the scientists have indicated that that's where the good habitat is, that's where the prey base is, and potentially most importantly, that trifecta allows for dispersing wolves from each of those subpopulations to kind of exchange genetic information over time. So a wolf might migrate from the Gila into the Grand Canyon region, take some of those Gila genetics into the Grand Canyon to, build resilience within that population. And likewise, a wolf from the Grand Canyon may move into the Sangre de Cristos and take some genetic information there. So we need to see this exchange among 3 or 4 populations even to really build that resiliency among the wild population as a whole.
Okay, now in your op-ed, you also wrote about a rule that mandated that wolves that were caught crossing north of Interstate 40 be captured or killed. Is that still the case with this rule, and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is still the case. It's a really disappointing rule. It's clearly driven by politics. I mean, Interstate 40 is by no means any kind of ecological or biological boundary. It is a political and arbitrary boundary. And yeah, currently, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, at the cost to taxpayers, will capture and remove wolves that travel north of I-40. And they will return them to the Gila bioregion, or even take them into captivity if they disperse more than once or twice. And we've also seen these wolves be killed by private parties when they cross that line, because U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, by drawing this line and preventing wolves from recolonizing where they ought to go, has kind of implied that wolves shouldn't be up north. And frankly, that's not what the science suggests, and that's not what the historical range suggests. So this arbitrary boundary is problematic in and of itself, because you're preventing wolves from dispersing where they need to go, but you're also sending a message that wolves don't belong in an area where scientifically, ecologically, culturally, historically, they do belong.
Okay, let's talk about the ecological impact of wolves. I know many of our viewers may have seen documentaries about how wolves were reintroduced in national parks across the country and how they made an impact there. But can you give us an understanding of reintroduction of wolves in certain areas, how they play a role in the natural environment?
Yeah, of course. And if you'll bear with me, I'll take a little step back. So over the last 100 years, essentially a little bit longer than that, but especially in the west of North America, we've seen large carnivores and what are called apex predators essentially removed from the ecosystem. So jaguars, wolves, mountain lions are still persisting, but their numbers have decreased. These large top of the food chain animals that have a really important impact all the way down the food chain, and this is called a trophic cascade. So when you take these apex carnivores out of the food chain, what you're doing is unbalancing the entire system below them. So when wolves are on the landscape, they instill what's called the biology of fear into species like elk and deer, and they move them around. So, elk and deer can still survive, but they can't just sit in riverbeds and eat all the willows, for example. When you take wolves away, that's exactly what happens. We see these kind of decimated riparian areas, the areas next to rivers and streams that have just been grazed down to the nubs. At that point, you're taking food away from other important ecosystem engineers like beavers that are shown to store water in wetlands. You're taking away bird habitat. And so you get this massive increase in ungulate populations, again, elk and deer primarily, and decreases in other critical wildlife populations. And that has impacts, not only on wildlife populations and plant populations, but on soil quality, on water quality, et cetera. And so there's still emerging science, even from the Yellowstone ecoregion, where wolves were first introduced in the mid-90s, about what exactly the impacts are. And some of that has come into question, the scope and scale of those impacts. But it's really, really difficult to argue that wolves and other apex predators don't have really regenerative impacts on these ecosystems, especially drying ecosystems here in the Southwest, when they're reintroduced, when they're allowed to have the ecological impact that they had historically.
Okay, now, do you think that the wolves need more protections, and if so, what are those?
Absolutely. You listed off those percentages of wolf mortalities, and we see that human-caused mortalities, both illegal killings, unknown mortalities, which I think are often illegal killings that have yet to be solved, and vehicular killings are the biggest impediment to their recovery. So, if humans are the biggest impediment, then that's something that we have a lot of control over. So I would suggest that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, the Arizona Game and Fish Department, that they all strengthen legal protections for wolves. And that means more law enforcement on the ground, more law enforcement in, particularly problematic areas where livestock conflict is prevalent, higher rates of prosecution for poachers, and generally a larger investment in ensuring that the public understands the role that these wolves play, their protected status, and why they're important to recover here in New Mexico and Arizona.
Okay, now obviously there's been a lot of reporting done about the conflict between livestock and wolves. I'd kind of like to get your perspective on this, because there is a lot of concern from ranchers in New Mexico that have a long history of ranching in our state, and their business and livelihood depends on the success of those ranches, and there appears to be conflict with this issue. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you think these conflicts can be addressed.
Sure. First and foremost, I am sympathetic to the plight of ranchers that have depredation take place, but wolves belong here. They are native to these landscapes. Like I said, they perform a really critical ecological role. Cows are not native to New Mexico or North America at all, and so those cows are actually out of place, and they're not well adapted for these dry and rugged landscapes that we're talking about. So wolves belong, first and foremost. Second thing I'll say is that yes, wolves do eat cows on occasion. That's unfortunate, but again, when a highly adapted native carnivore is on the landscape and a big juicy hamburger is also on the landscape, there's likely going to be conflict. And it's my opinion that the onus of solving that conflict shouldn't be incumbent upon the native species necessarily. And then we see a lot of data coming from the USDA especially that shows that carnivore depredations on livestock, including cattle and sheep, are a tiny, tiny fraction of the total livestock loss. So you're way more likely to have your cow stolen, exponentially more likely to have your cow die of disease or of birthing problems or weather problems than you are to have your cow eaten by a carnivore.
Okay, now.
And then finally,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Please go ahead and finish.
Yeah, the last thing I would say is there are a lot of tried and true, non-lethal, proactive techniques to reduce and mitigate livestock-wildlife conflict on the landscape that are available to ranchers. And a lot of ranchers are keen to use them, and they are proving to work. But there is kind of a cultural, I think, reticence to trying out these new practices because there is, I think, kind of a deep-seated hatred of wolves among, again, a subset of ranchers especially.
Okay, I want to dive into that a little bit more, but first I want to read a statement from Lauren Patterson, president of the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association. He was quoted in the Albuquerque Journal as saying that, quote, "The wolves are putting the livelihoods of family ranchers at risk, although their organization doesn't condone illegal killing of wolves." He went on to say that ranchers are disappointed that the Fish and Wildlife Service isn't supporting those whose herds are being, quote, "significantly and detrimentally impacted by these predators," end quote. Of course, we've reached out to the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association, and we look forward to hearing more from them in the future, possibly on this issue. But I want to dive into what you said about there being some signs of success with some measures taken to help, lessen these conflicts of wolves and livestock. So what are these things that have been put in place that are showing signs of success?
Sure, I'll just list a few, although there's there's kind of a slew of them, but the ones that come to mind first and foremost are range riders. So that is, cowboys out on the landscape with their herds of cows, so that you've got eyes on your cows, eyes on potential predators. That is a practice that, in kind of traditional ranching was commonplace and now has largely gone away. Fencing and fladry. Fladry is kind of a bright flag that is attached to fences that deters wolves from entering areas. Removing carcasses that have died of other causes besides wolf kills, removing those from the landscape will deter wolves from getting a taste of that animal and sticking around hoping for another easy meal. There are a few others, but one that WildEarth Guardians specifically works on is called permit retirement, wherein ranchers who are having a difficult time making ends meet, especially in the arid Southwest, they can be bought out of their public lands permit, and they get a very hefty payout, and they no longer run cows on an allotment that then can be used for wildlife habitat and can encourage wolf presence. The other thing I would add, just in response to that statement, is that compensation is available to livestock owners who lose cattle to carnivores, both at the state level and the federal level. So again, while I am sympathetic to ranchers who lose cattle, they are made whole by the money that's paid to them by the state and the feds.
Okay, as we move on, I want to move on and talk about other issues, but I'd like to kind of get your perspective on this. So the Fish and Wildlife Service are taking public comment on this issue. They're hoping to have a new plan by the end of the year. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this, and what would you like to see happen with this plan?
Sure. Well, broadly, WildEarth Guardians and other organizations have had to go to the courts over and over and over to try to push Fish and Wildlife Service to do right by these wolves, to ensure that the strongest possible recovery plan is in place, to ensure that the best possible management rules are in place. And so Fish and Wildlife Service is kind of being dragged kicking and screaming via litigation to do right by wolves. And we're in another one of those cycles. Regarding the current plan that they're taking comments on right now, again, I want to see the highest possible legal protections for wolves. And I won't rehash the list I gave, but they need to be, illegal killings need to be deterred and minimized. And then when they do occur, they need to be persecuted and they need to be publicized. And I think those are the biggest things that need to happen right now in this current plan. WildEarth Guardians is driving some public comments, and you can find out how to submit comments and what we're saying if you go to our website, wildearthguardians.org.
Okay, let's talk about some other issues. What are some major concerns of yours with other wildlife issues in New Mexico that you think need to be addressed?
That is a great question. I think there's a really strong coalition right now, which includes a lot of hunters and anglers, includes conservationists, wildlife advocates, who have seen that the way that wildlife is managed at the state level no longer serves us now in the 21st century. So state wildlife agencies were set up in a time when, there wasn't a climate crisis, there wasn't massive human expansion and habitat loss, and they were set up to kind of navigate that world. And we're in a very, very different world now in the 21st century. We've got climate change, we have a biodiversity collapse ongoing, we have a mass extinction event. And the focus on these state wildlife agencies, including New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, has always been game species. So elk, deer, rainbow trout, even kind of introduced species like oryx and things like that you find down near Las Cruces. And we think there needs to be a wholesale shift in the priorities. The perceived constituents of New Mexico Department of Game and Fish has historically been hunters and anglers. And if you're talking about demographics, people who look like me, white men, and that needs to change. The constituents of New Mexico Department of Game and Fish have to be all New Mexicans. And all New Mexicans have a stake in all wildlife surviving the biodiversity crisis that we're going through. So we need a department that's mission is to protect all wildlife, not just game species. We need them to have authority over all wildlife, which they currently do not have. We need new funding so that they have the resources to protect all wildlife. And we need new measures of success. Currently one of the biggest measures of performance for New Mexico Department of Game and Fish is how many elk tags they sell. That's fine. That keeps people who hunt elk happy. But that's not a good barometer of how wildlife, by and large, is faring in the state of New Mexico. So we need a total overhaul of how we imagine and govern and manage wildlife here in New Mexico.
Okay, so you brought up a lot of issues there. We just have about a minute left, but I just want to. It's fine. I just like to hear, like, how do we address this situation and ensure that all communities can really have a say in what's happening with wildlife in New Mexico and the issues that surround them.
Yeah, well, the way I'll get to this is a little roundabout, but hopefully it'll take us to a good space. Senator Heinrich is one of the co-sponsors of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that is set to inject $1.3 billion annually into state wildlife agencies across the nation. And that money is earmarked for non-game species, and especially species that are of the greatest conservation concern. So if we can, through the New Mexico legislature, through the administration, if we can, again, reform what our Department of Wildlife looks like so that there is an emphasis on all wildlife and all New Mexicans rather than just game species and just those who are pursuing game species, we have a real chance to use that influx of money to protect some of the species that are currently struggling.
Okay, Chris Smith is a Southwest wildlife advocate for WildEarth Guardians. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us on the program.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, Anthony.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Murnau. We'll see you next time.